Hi. In this lecture, I would like to speak about Plato's parable of the cave. This parable presents, of course, one of the most iconic and enduring images in all of philosophy, and most people will probably be familiar with it already. I think it's worth speaking about, partly for the same reason that it's remained such a staple, such a keystone of philosophical investigation and inquiry for all these years. And at the same time, I don't have any pretenses of being able to cover everything in the parable and exhaust the parable. Certainly, if the meaning and interpretation of the parable hasn't been exhausted in nearly 3,000 years, I don't think that a short lecture for a critical thinking class is going to exhaust what countless philosophers over centuries have not done. That being said, I think there are some very very important and significant insights that we can glean from it, and so I hope to at least offer a couple of those rather than by way of suggestion and invitation for further thinking than by way of conclusion. And this, in fact, I'll return to this in the interpretation of the parable itself. This notion of the difference between a sort of holding a question open compared to closing a question, clasping a question down around an answer. In some way, the parable of the cave itself is a kind of pictorial representation of just that process. But sort of what I have in mind for outline is not to read the parable. That's something that anyone can accomplish on his or her own. It's also something that I've done on a prior occasion, and I can link to a lecture if I can link to a lecture in the notes here to this video, and so anyone is invited to follow that link. There's also have been many different animations and illustrations of Plato's parable of the cave throughout the years, and I'll link to at least one of those as well. So a person wishing to at least become familiar and acquaint him or herself with this parable has many opportunities to do that. And so if we refrain from doing that, it's not because the opportunity was not provided. So rather than to read the parable, I have in mind sort of to move on to the next, transition to the sort of the next phase, the next development in relating to something unknown. Or put another way, when we wish to think critically about something, there first has to be something there presented to us about which we can think critically. And in this case, we're taking this parable as our object. And so what I have in mind to do is sort of take for granted or take for given that the parable is there before us, and then proceed to the next step, which is attempting to recognize the meaning of what has been presented before us. And one way of thinking about this is a sort of reflective thinking, or thinking twice about something, thinking about something a second time. We may have thought through it, followed the plot as we read it. And then the point of thinking critically is to, again, sort of think a second time and interpret what we read, interpret the meaning of what we read, discern the meaning in what we read. And so I hope to, at least today, accomplish a little bit by way of, again, more by way of invitation than by way of conclusion. First, I would like to just say a little bit about the nature of a parable or an image in general, in respect to philosophy and to understanding, to knowledge. The second thing, I guess, is to try to as a development from the first point about images or parables as such, it's to try to pose the question and inquire into what Plato's parable is presenting us with, and this will there's I guess a number of points, maybe 2 or 3 different points that I'll just mention in that respect in terms of possible directions for interpretation of this parable. And then finally, I'll just say a few words about the tradition from which this the tradition that I was going to say that from which this parable stems, but it's really, in some ways, this parable is the kind of keynote of a tradition, a philosophical tradition that's known by Platonism or Neoplatonism. And so, lastly, I'll just say a few words about the sort of the context, the philosophical context, and the philosophical influence that this parable has had, at least in the most immediate sense. And so I think that in itself is already quite an ambitious expectation for a short lecture like this. But without further ado, then I will do my best to accomplish those things. And so, turning to the first point, the sort of a question of what's going on in a parable or a story or an image. What's going on in the first place? Like, what is the purpose of it, and what is what is behind it? Why do we bother to, for example, remember and record a parable like this in the first place? Again, its composition almost over close to 3,000 years have elapsed since Plato first recorded this parable. Not 3,000 years, but more than 2,000 certainly. And so our question is, what? Clearly, there's some value or some significance in this, and I hope to just say a little bit about what the significance might be. What is a parable trying to accomplish? And by whatever we discover about a parable, this by extension is also relevant to any kind of image, any kind of representation. And I think that's actually an entry point, is the concept of representation. The parable is attempting to represent something. And then we have to ask, what is the parable attempting to represent? And why couldn't it just present the thing rather than representing it? And one way to understand what a parable is doing is that it's lending a sort of body or a sort of shape, a sort of visible form, a perceptible form, at least to the imagination, an imaginal form. It's lending an imaginal body to something that in itself doesn't have a shape, doesn't have a body, doesn't have a form. It's lending visibility. It's representing invisible things through visible things. And so that's a way to think about this parable, is that it's presenting visible images, again, visible to the mind's eye, visible images of invisible elements or principles. And as a rule, or sort of almost by definition, that's what an image is. An image is always of something. And so to accomplish or achieve a sort of critical thinking about any kind of representation, achieving that kind of critical insight will consist in grasping or perceiving or achieving insight into the thing that the image is of. So again, an image is always an image of something, and we're attempting to win through to a perception of not only the image, but also what the image is of, what the image means to represent. And so again, it's a sort of invisible, something invisible. The parable gives it a kind of body, and so now we can move on to sort of pose the question about Plato's parable of the cave. What is being represented for us? And a couple things will immediately sort of occur to a person who sort of reflects on the structure of the parable. One of those is there's a sort of gradated ascent. The ascent happens by degrees, and we have the first scenario of being chained to the bottom of the cave and mistaking shadows for realities, and then there's a sort of a transformation of one of the individuals chained in the bottom of the cave, and it's a real a transformation. It's a conversion, literally a conversion, and by that I mean the person in the parable conversion, of course, it comes from a Latin word meaning turn. Verse means to turn. And so a conversion describes a sort of turning about or turning around. And we see that in the cave. The person turns from facing the shadows and believing the shadows to be their own realities. The person turns about and suddenly perceives a new dimension, I guess, or a new depth to those shadows. And suddenly, before this person didn't even recognize the shadows as shadows. This person believed the shadows to be, not shadows, but real things. This conversion consists in recognizing suddenly the cause, and by the same token, the shadows are revealed to be effects of that cause. So in the first place, there was no perception of this kind of causal system or causal relationship. Suddenly the person is able to perceive the figures that are casting those shadows, and also the source of light that's a necessary condition for these shadows to be cast. And so one way of looking at this is if we sort of, and specifically for our purposes, we can say, in what way does Plato's parable of the cave represent the process of one way to say this is the process of achieving the insight that critical thinking is meant to deliver us. Another way of thinking is the process of philosophy, and these are in some ways synonymous. Yeah, how it's the sort of the striving or the affinity for wisdom, and this process of attaining wisdom or attaining insight. And again, critical thinking is the method or the instrument by which we accomplish that. And so if we take this parable as a kind of, one thing is probably, I guess, worth really spelling out explicitly. It's maybe implied already, but it's probably worth, again, just underscoring or emphasizing. It's that the process of critical thinking, for instance, or the process of philosophy, the process of winning through to insight or to wisdom, this doesn't look like anything. It doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't have. It's not in itself. It's not visible. And so precisely what Plato's parable of the cave can offer us actually is a kind of it can sort of lend a body or lend a vicarious form to this kind of interior process of cognition or of philosophy that itself doesn't look like anything. Yeah. But Plato's parable of the cave allows us to sort of perceive it as though to confront something that otherwise more or less transpires behind our eyes, and so we remain kind of not ignorant of it, but it remains invisible to us. And so we can think of one element of winning through to that kind of insight, or in the process of winning through to that insight, is to be able to recognize the causes of things, yeah, rather than basically in a sort of naive way, just assuming everything explains itself. We begin to recognize these internal relations between phenomena, from one thing to the next thing, and our experience. In our experience, the world itself becomes more coherent. And what I mean by that is, or to illustrate that point of drawing on images from the parable, it would be nearly impossible and purely speculative to attempt to understand the behavior and the conduct of those shadows in the bottom of the cave in themselves. But the moment that we have achieved this kind of turning about or conversion, then we are perceiving the causes of those shadows, and these figures then we can begin to draw inferences and relationships and begin to understand again the behavior and the conduct of those shadows, because we have included in our concept, in our conception, we've included the causes for those effects. And Aristotle is Plato's most famous student, has a quite a pithy definition for understanding, and he says, we say we understand a thing. We say we understand a thing when we have first grasped its causes. And so grasping the causes of something is essential to understanding that thing. And cause can be construed very broadly. And in this parable we have one instance. Cause for Aristotle was much more than we often imply by that term today. Cause consisted in everything. Cause included the context, I guess. So by cause, Aristotle also meant more or less what we mean by context. So we could think of something like to understand a thing is to grasp its causes and conditions and context. And that's clearly what this parable is illustrating for us, is kind of ever-widening sphere of comprehension in respect to the causes and the conditions and the context of what's going on in the bottom of the cave. Yeah. Because the next degree of ascent is to basically grasp or to comprehend the condition of being in a cave itself, which before was unknown to the at least to the individuals in the bottom of the cave. They didn't picture themselves to be in the cave. They didn't. Again, they had no comprehension of, or they had very limited comprehension of their own condition. And so we see a sort of again a progressive increase in respect to the ability to comprehend the whole scenario that's at stake. Yeah, it's the kind of transition from a very very limited and myopic view to something much more encompassing, much more comprehensive, much more holistic is another way to look at it. And so then we also should just it's worth emphasizing that what keeps the individuals prisoned in the bottom of the cave, in the parable that it's described as being bound to the bottom of the cave as though with chains. But if we take this as a kind of an image or a representation or an allegory of the process of achieving insight or achieving knowledge, achieving wisdom, and then also the process of critical thinking that leads us there. I do think it's worth emphasizing that that those chains, the image of a chain in the parable, if we want to translate that into the context of achieving wisdom or achieving insight by way of critical thinking, the translation would have to render the chains into something like believing one already knows, believing one is already free. In this case, in the case of the parable, the individuals at the bottom of the cave don't really need chains to keep them there because they don't know that they're there in the first place. Yeah, if a prisoner doesn't know he or she is a prisoner, this is a very easy prisoner to maintain. Yeah, the minute the individuals in the bottom of the cave, the minute it dawns on them that they are prisoners, then suddenly they at least can be inclined to escape. As long as they think they're already free, as long as we think we already know, we won't seek to learn. And so in some way, and this relates both, I mentioned that I would return to this point at the very beginning of this lecture. And so the idea is Plato's parable of the cave, in some way it's enjoining us to what Socrates has kind of personified or embodied for us, which is this learned ignorance, or the Socratic irony of the foundation of wisdom being a sort of knowledge of one's own lack of knowledge of one's own ignorance, and this kind of, it establishes in us and cultivates in us, fosters in us a fertile condition of mind in which we're never assuming that we already know, and this keeps our eyes open. This keeps us curious and interested, and we see in some way it's very similar to the condition of sort of childlike wonder, and in fact both Plato and Aristotle in some context even define philosophy as the kind of the perpetual state of wonder. Aristotle says that all human beings by nature desire to know, and Plato says all philosophy begins with wonder. And so this Plato's parable of the cave, again, it's absolutely just such a powerful and iconic depiction of this paradoxical relationship between belief as the antithesis of learning. The moment we believe something, it's impossible. The moment we think we know something, it's impossible to learn anything. We could sort of close the windows on the shop of learning, close the shutters on the shop of learning. And so again, in the Plato is kind of enjoining us in the spirit of the philosopher. And this name, the word philosopher itself, it kind of, in some way, Plato's parable of the cave, it depicts, as I suggested, as a kind of depiction of critical thinking or the striving towards wisdom. This itself is the kind of the etymology of the term philosopher in the first place. Philo indicates a sort of affinity for or love for, striving for, approaching, and then Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And so the word philosopher itself indicates a kind of, again, an inclination or an affinity, a love for wisdom. And again, Plato's parable of the cave, we see this depicted as a form of ascent towards the mouth of the cave and towards the sun itself. And so this is indeed what we see is the degrees of ascent. The individual proceeds first from the bottom of the cave, and then to perceive the figures that are casting the shadows, and then continues on the upward ascent, and finally reaches the mouth of the cave, and sort of gains his first his or her first vision of the waking world outside of the half-waking world of the cave. And so I hope I've at least given some sort of stimulating suggestions for further reflection and further contemplation on this parable. And I've tried to sort of present it both positively as what the parable represents, as a sort of archetypal picture of the process by which we learn about the world and about life. And I hope I've also, as can often be helpful, is to sort of turn the thing around then and sort of present the antithesis of this philosophical quest, and that's sort of the posing the question: what prevents everyone other than this philosopher, as depicted in the parable? What prevents everyone else from doing this? What prevents everyone else from seeking the truth, from striving from striving for wisdom? What prevents these people? And again, I suggested at least one thing is a sort of complacency or smug self-satisfaction that one has already attained all of the understanding that there is to be had about one or another subject. Yeah, and so there's the individuals in the bottom of the cave. They see no need to seek for anything beyond what they already perceive. On top of this, it might be added, just because this is explicitly spelled out in the parable, that the person who has ascended and escaped the cave and then wishes to return just for the sake of, I think we all sense this, the sake of, there's something that about knowledge, about understanding, about wisdom, that it wishes to be shared, and it wishes, it kind of inspires us to serve as its mouthpiece. Once we understand something or we see something, we wish to reveal it to other people. We don't wish to hold it to ourselves in a kind of an egotistical way. But the parable explicitly spells out how the risk of being ostracized by someone, by basically this philosopher, all of his or her fellows in the bottom of the cave. They don't wish to hear what he or she has to say, the stories about the mouth of the cave. They will say that this philosopher went up to the mouth of the cave and left his or her mind up there and came back in a kind of insanity. Yeah. And in fact, in the parable, the person is put to death. And again, I think this, in some way, it depicts a historical event in Socrates' life, where the politicians in Athens convicted Socrates to death, precisely for this, for basically encouraging or inciting people to question what they already think they know. Yeah, and so one reason that, or one translation of those chains that keep people in the bottom of the cave, one interpretation or one translation of that image is to see it as complacency or self-satisfaction. Another alternative translation is to see it as fear of going against a kind of a scientific consensus on something. Because we know from our own lives and we see in the parable that it can be dangerous. And so nobody's being forced or being compelled to seek this further knowledge. It's always an impulse or a striving that has to come from within, basically. And so now, having kind of again summarized the parable and laid out at least one aspect of interpretation, we can see that the parable, again, it's depicting invisible form. Its invisible form is depicting invisible processes. And Plato even says so much. He says in Republic, just after recounting the parable of the cave, he describes that the parable, it's meant to, basically the sun in the parable is meant to represent the ultimate good. And he describes the good as basically what, and here I'm beginning to transition into what I mentioned as the third element of this lecture, which is just to give a little bit of background into the philosophical underpinnings of Plato's worldview. And it's really as far as we know, it's the kind of the philosophical outlook that Plato kind of developed, and himself, he's the author of it in some ways. But this view that the sun represents the ultimate good, and so we imagine that we recognize. In one way, we might think, well, good is just subjective, or it's merely personal, but that's almost antithetical to Platonism, and Platonism really firmly believes and argues for the notion of a true and ultimate good, and the idea would be something like what makes a good hat, and we might say, well, it's purely personal preference. But clearly it's not. And the reason that I say that is because, and the first image that comes to my mind is Johnny Appleseed wearing the pot on his head. And so certainly that's a satisfactory hat. But there are better hats. There are hats that would, for example, keep you warm. For instance, not be made of cast iron or whatever the pot was made out of. A hat, if it had a big hole in the top of it, wouldn't be such a good hat. And that's a kind of maybe trivial example, but it illustrates a principle, which is that if the hat goes too far away from hatness, from the good of a hat, it becomes a worse hat. So it moves away from good and goes towards bad. And finally, at the kind of the outskirts, the perimeter, it's not really a hat at all. And these kind of marginal cases, like what I mentioned about the cast iron. Or maybe it's a pot, made of steel, that Johnny Appleseed wore on his head, at least according to the apocryphal stories about him. And so we can see, we could understand everything in that way. Taking like a book, if a book at some point ceases to be a book once it, doesn't have any words in it, for instance. Or a triangle. It's there are better triangles and there are worse triangles. And ultimately, though, there's a sort of boundary or a limit, at which point, as they approach the boundary or the limit, they become worse triangles, and at some point they cease to become triangles altogether. And for instance, imagine a shape with four sides, and it's no longer a triangle. Yeah. By the same token, in the other direction, a kind of approach to the good, you realize that no visible triangle can be the ultimate triangle, or no visible triangle can be triangularity itself. Yeah. And the reason for this is that every triangle that you, for example, draw, for instance, on a paper with a pencil, first of all, it will be in some way imperfect in respect to the interior angles might not add up to 180 degrees, the lines won't be perfectly straight, etc. But there's another and maybe more subtle and more interesting way in which you can never achieve the perfect triangle or the triangularity as such. You can only approximate it. So again, I've tried to depict the way in which something can stray and kind of move towards becoming a worse triangle, so stray kind of outwards towards the periphery. But I'm also now trying to show the way in which the very center, the ultimate triangularity, the ultimate good of the triangle, it can never be exhausted or finely pinned down, so to speak, in any particular triangle. Every triangle in some way approximates this ultimate triangle, or this form of the triangle, to use Plato's words. Actually, the word he uses is in Greek is eidos, and it's in English we have an equivalent, which is idea. So the ultimate idea of a triangle, you will never pin down or exhaust the ultimate idea of a triangle in any particular instance of that triangle. Every particular instance in some way participates the triangle to the degree that we recognize it as a triangle in the first place. But at the same time, it will never exhaust it. And the reason is because, for example, suppose you draw a triangle on paper with a pencil. Well, it's a triangle, right? But it's also has, many elements of that same thing are also not triangle. And for instance, just the graphite from the pencil, and the paper, and everything else about it that is kind of again it comes together with the triangle, but it's non-triangle elements. And so the idea is that we evaluate, or we're able to recognize goodness in every individual instance of anything, and in fact, and Plato actually describes in the Republic, he says the good, he describes it as both what brings something into being in our minds, so what brings an idea into our minds. So picture the triangle. He says the good is both what brings the triangle into our minds, and it's the same power, the same power is a good word for it, that brings the triangle into existence in our minds as brings the triangle into existence in the outer world. They both proceed from the ultimate good. And in the parable, Plato depicts this ultimate good as the sun. The sun is a good example as something that's, again, it's the sun. This can become quite confusing or esoteric in a way. But the sun, it's also the sun. It's not the ultimate sun. It's a sun. It's not the ultimate sun, and the reason is because there's many ways to approach this, but for example, if we assume the theories of physics, we have to say that there was a time when the sun didn't exist, and that in fact the sun that we see, or that the philosopher who escaped from the cave would see, that sun, it's also, there was a time where it didn't exist, and it's a dying sun. Like the sun, it's burning out. It's kind of again, it's dying, and one day, hopefully millions of years hence, the sun will cease to exist. And so at the same time, while it's a sun, it's also kind of like, at the same time, it has the negation of itself contained within it, like its own death. When we look at the sun, we're also seeing the death of that sun. And so Plato, though, believes the world is the kind of place in which we're able to um, proceed from what we can see, which is what is visible to us, to the kind of invisible archetypes or essences of things, and we're able to not merely fantasize about them, but that our minds share a kind of homogeneity with the world that we live in. And so Plato, in some ways, for Plato, thinking itself and critical thinking, it's not merely something that we do inside our own heads. It's not just an afterthought. It's rather in the same way that our eyes perceive light, in just the same way our minds perceive realities and perceive ideas. So thinking is not just an afterthought; it's an organ of perception, just like our eyes are for outer things, our minds and our intelligence is for inner things. Yeah. Or inner things. By that, by inner, I just mean not outer. I just mean things that aren't visible. And this might seem kind of abstract or esoteric, but it shouldn't be. And the reason is because it's in some ways it's been the topic of this whole kind of investigation into the parable of the cave itself. We are meanings and concepts and interpretations. Those are all inner things in the sense that we don't see them with our eyes. Maybe we see them through our eyes, but we grasp them and we see them with our minds. And Platonism is kind of the original philosophical doctrine that really tries to articulate this relationship that our intelligence bears with the world at large, and it firmly situates again. So the thinking and our minds, they're not like aliens or they're not inconsequential or subjective, but rather they really belong in the world, and the world and the mind belong together. And so basically what we're seeing in Plato's parable of the cave is we're seeing an image of a person, like in bodily form, ascending upwards towards the mouth of a cave, and we're meant to recognize that the plot or the narrative, it's also representing something that is invisible, or that's internal. And Plato literally describes, he says, I actually have written down the quote. He says, whereas this is in Book 7, whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, he's talking about the figure in the bottom of the cave, or the individual who turned around so that he could see the figures that were casting those shadows. He says, just as the person was unable to see what was behind him or her in the bottom of the cave, except by turning his or her whole body to face those shadows and to face the mouth of the cave, so too the instrument of knowledge, the mind, can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of untruth to that of truth, to that of reality. And so in some ways Plato gives the kind of the key or the interpretation, the meaning of his parable right there. And it's, in other words, it's using the form of a body climbing out of a cave to represent the ascent of the soul from existence at one level to higher levels of existence. And so that's probably a good place to stop. I hope that at least a number of things that I said will be able to serve as encouragement for further reflection. And again, this parable has endured for thousands of years, and I don't pretend to have finished it off in this small lecture, and I don't think there's any risk of that. And so I hope maybe let that be an encouragement to not flag in our striving to glean new insights from this parable. And so that's probably a good place to conclude. And with that, I will wish everyone the best until next time.